Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to PsychoBible, babbling about psychology and theology. A while ago, I watched this video by Mark Queppet. He's a self-development coach. He's big in the manosphere and the no-fap movement, and he's a Catholic Christian. His YouTube channel used to be called Universal Man. Now he just named it after himself. And I've really enjoyed his content over the past few years, and I recommend his videos to my clients all the time, especially my guys who are struggling with sexual addiction or pornography. He has some really good playlists on there for guys struggling with those issues. And apparently recently he's been going through a bit of a paradigm shift in the way he understands personal growth. So in September, he put out this video on why discipline is lame and devotion is better. And I loved it. It touched on a lot of things I teach in my counseling. And it was fresh in my mind as I was preparing for the sermon I gave at church in September. And my sermon was about worship, about genuine discipleship and transformation. So obviously I would encourage you to check out that sermon. There was so much in it, packed into that 52 minutes or whatever. But I want to discuss the video by Mark Queppet and further explore some of the ideas he presents and show how they connect to some concepts in Theology of the Body, which I talk about all the time on this channel, and Reintegrative Therapy, of which I'm a practitioner, or I'm learning how to do. So I'm going to play some portions of his video, and I would play the whole thing, but it's 40 minutes long, so it's really good. So please watch the whole video on your own. Before I play it though, there are a couple things I need to add. I'm really impressed with how he seems to be speaking extemporaneously, without a script, and these ideas are just flowing out of him. So he gives really good descriptions of discipline and devotion. He shows the differences between the two based on his point of view on what they are. He explains that people tend to use it to interchangeably, and understandably so. But he makes a distinction, and he does a good job describing those distinctions. But he doesn't quite define them, and it's really important to define our terms. So first, according to my American Heritage College Dictionary, devotion is ardent, selfless affection and dedication, such as to a person or a principle. And to devote means to give or apply one's time, attention, or your whole self to an activity, cause, or person. Whereas discipline means training expected to produce a specific character or pattern of behavior, especially moral or mental improvement. Another definition included there is control obtained by enforcing compliance or order. So with those definitions in mind, let's watch some segments of Mark's video.
And what I'm going to be covering is the difference between discipline and devotion. Okay, these words are often used kind of interchangeably, but also then separately. It's like discipline's usually used in a self-developmental sort of context, and then devotion tends to be used more in like a spiritual or religious kind of context, but they can kind of mean sort of the same thing. It means like you get yourself to do the right thing, right? Well, I am separating them apart, and I'm going to tell you how I'm separating them apart, and that can be used for the same thing. Like they can be used to get you to do good stuff, but they feel entirely differently. They're entirely different systems inside of you, and they have very different effects while you're actually using them. They feel very differently. Like the thing that I guess I've come to is that by my own definitions, I hate discipline. I realize like I do not want to be a disciplined person at all. I've been a disciplined person. I know how to do it. I just don't want to anymore because it kind of sucks. And you can get everything that you want from discipline from devotion. It's just better all around. So at a high level, the difference between discipline and devotion is that discipline is much more like a battering ram, and devotion is much more like a river. Okay? It's like discipline can be very high impact. It can work very quickly. But I would also say there's a lot of kinetic force involved. And so there's a lot of learning how to really construct those high impacts, learning how to actually manage them safely, because you can very quickly burn yourself out on discipline. You can very quickly, hurt yourself in some way. You can get yourself to behave inauthentically using discipline. It also takes a lot of energy. You can, a lot of times it leads to a snapback, relapse, fall into old patterns or worse. And it can also just cause you to treat yourself poorly, as we'll see, and cause you to deny some of your fundamental values. Devotion, on the other hand, it's much more like a flowing river, okay? Like if it's a single boulder, devotion will just flow around it, okay? The discipline is just gonna have to punch through it. Devotion just flow around it. But at the same time, devotion can literally, like a river can, cut right through a mountain, okay? It's kind of like, think of it's like a force of nature in many ways. It's like, well, both of them sort of are, but think about it like this. Like discipline is they're both deeply human activities. Discipline is deeply human in a bad way, in the way that humans can create atom bombs and genetically enhanced viruses and horrible things like that. We can create things that in nature wouldn't be created, right? And so discipline, I would argue, is actually one of those things. It can be used for good in the same way that weapons can be used for good and whatnot, but it's not what we want to be relying on, I don't think. Devotion, it's also deeply human, but in a different way, kind of like how humans can love and create in a way that animals and other things in the world cannot. That's what devotion is. It's more primal and elemental, but also in some ways more elevated and sublime. So, okay, that's enough abstraction. Let's start getting into more of the specifics. But one final point before we do that is that discipline can be inauthentic, devotion cannot. And so, that'll factor into things here. So, if we're going to start getting technical about it, discipline is focused on following certain rules. It's a getting mentality. At its core, it's a vacuous sort of structure that says, I'm going to get some kind of outcome. Okay. And so let's use an example from my own life that literally just happened, right? So, I was having this talk with my wife about how, hey, I really want to level up. I gotta kick things into a higher gear here to meet my business goals. And so I'm going to start getting up early. Okay. I'm going to get up and I'm going to get up probably 5 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, and get to it when I've been getting up around 8 or so when my daughter tends to wake up. And that was the plan, going to bed, and I had my alarm set. I went to bed early, was ready to do it. But then my daughter, she woke up 5 times in the middle of the night between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., 4:30 a.m. It was just bad night for her. I don't know why. And so from the discipline mentality, it would say, hey, you made this commitment to get up at this time. Be disciplined, get up. Just do it anyway, right? And that's what discipline is. It's like, say, here are the rules, here's the system, you do the thing, doesn't matter how hard it is. This can work, like I said, but it's just I don't want to do that anymore. Also, it can kind of seem counterproductive. The argument is, well, you force yourself to get up anyway, and then it just becomes the way it is, and then some days are going to be better than others, blah, blah, blah. But devotion, on the other hand, it's instead of about trying to follow some system perfectly, about trying to get some kind of very measurable result that you can tick off, it's more about expressing certain values. So this sleep disruption, it's just a boulder to flow around, all right? And so that's the way I approached it, because I've been thinking about this stuff. And I was like, all right, well, my sleep's kind of screwed up here. If I just force myself to get up, then I'm going to crash in the middle of the day anyway, and I'm going to have to sleep more anyway. So I'd rather just sleep now and then be able to work throughout the day. And so I just rolled around it, and I was like, you know what? She's not going to sleep this bad every night. And tomorrow morning, I'm still going to try and get up early. It's just it's just a smooth, quick reset. There's no guilt involved. There's no beating yourself up. It's just here's the goal, and I'm going to keep flowing toward it, kind of like water going downhill. If it reaches something, it might build up a little bit. If it hits a dam, it's going to build up behind the dam, but eventually, if the water keeps flowing, it's going to go over the dam. It doesn't fight. It doesn't cry. It doesn't feel like it needs to always burst through the dam, although it can do that. Usually it just swells. It just swells. And that's the thing here, is that devotion, when it's hooked up properly, it'll just keep going. It's an abundant source. Discipline is something that needs to be forced from your conscious mind over your emotional mind. And so it takes a lot of willpower that then is very draining, and you can run out of it, right? If that's the thing that's driving you, is your head overriding your heart, well, that's something that's very, very limited. Let's take this further, right? Let's get a little bit even more specific about this, particularly about what it looks like inside of yourself. So when you're trying to get yourself to engage in an act of will, from a discipline standpoint, what you're trying to do is squash any conflicted parts of you. You can think of discipline as like a state of internal conquest, where you basically silence all dissent inside of you. So it's like your mind or your emotions are like, I don't want to go for a run right now. The disciplined person learns how to squash that, repress that little voice, and yeah, it can work. You can kill that part, or at least repress it, right? And you can get yourself to do hard things and that sort of stuff. But the problem with this is that it basically puts you at war with yourself, right? That's the whole thing. And the question then becomes, how do you actually generate the energy to do that? How do you create the psychological pressure to engage in that forceful repression, right? Well, fundamentally, I think discipline is fear-based. It's like, well, if you don't do this thing, well, then what happens to you, right? Oh, you miss out on your goal. Oh, you don't get the thing that you want. You're a little fatty, or oh, you're a little weakling, or you're a little lazy, or like whatever it is, whatever the name is you call yourself. That's all you have to rely on when you can't get that spike of dopamine that automatically motivates you. And yes, sometimes via discipline or devotion, you're going to fall into a nice groove of dopamine where it's like you're hooked on what you're doing, whether it's your training, your productivity, your spiritual practice, whatever it is. There'll be periods where like your brain gets a little buzz from doing it and you're excited and you don't even need to try anymore. It's just like you just do it because you want to do it, right? And that's awesome. But when you don't, the disciplined approach uses fear and the whip against yourself. You have to create that psychological pain inside of you and make that pain greater than the perceived pain of, not doing the thing, or the perceived pain of doing the thing. And so it's like you got to be more painful inside, and that'll drive you through. Devotion, on the other hand, okay, it is not about repression. It's in fact the exact opposite. All right, it's aspirationally based. It's about connecting to your desires and turning your desires up as much as possible. All of them, okay, all of them, because the idea with devotion is that the good guy is going to win inside of you as long as you give him the space to work. Now, there's a cost to this. The cost is that you have to allow for conflict inside of you. Because the thing that disciplined people, I think, are terrified of in many ways, and I know this because I was a disciplined person, and I know how to be a disciplined person, and really what you cannot allow for is dissent inside of yourself, at least not much of it. If you want to maintain the discipline, you cannot allow any kind of conflict. You got to rule with an iron fist, because as soon as you start getting cracks in the coherence of your drive, all of a sudden your power takes a nosedive. And so allowing conflict for the disciplined person is really not useful, okay? And so they get really good at squashing it. And this is actually something that I'm trying to unlearn, is that I've built up this reflex to squash any emotional reaction that doesn't line up with my most immediate, desires that I put on paper. And this actually doesn't really serve super well, because it puts you in a position where you are disconnecting yourself from pieces of your psyche. You're actually cutting yourself off from these different parts of you. And these parts, they all hold a lot of energy. And you just actually are kind of becoming less of yourself. You're kind of like repressing a big chunk of it. And then you got all this free-floating energy and desire that you don't look at because it threatens the coherence of your narrative, and then it just comes out usually in inauthentic ways, in some kind of escape, some kind of coping mechanism, some kind of anger, some kind of something like that. And so devotion allows everyone to have a seat at the table, okay? Doesn't necessarily mean that everybody gets to drive the ship, but it allows everyone, meaning all the pieces of your subpersonality, all the pieces of your personality, all the pieces of your mind, all your emotions, thoughts, and feelings, they can all come to the table, okay? And then what you do then is you have to allow all of it to go up to max volume. And what you're looking for then is the intersection point where your strongest desires are aligned. So the skill on the other side of it, on the devotional side, is learning how to actually draw upon those deeper, more real desires in the moments that matter. And what's interesting here is that with discipline, it's really about generating tension. It's about learning how to think about the things that get you ready to go, ready to like fired up and ready to, chew through a brick wall with your teeth. Okay. Devotion's the other way. It's like I was saying, it's like water. It's like you have to become more supple. You have to become more relaxed, because what I found is that it's kind of like devotion's like this combustion sort of engine. It's all right. You let these tensions build up inside of you of your desires. So for example, say, let's just make it real simple. Say you want to, follow your diet. My wife gets mad at me because I always use diet examples, but they're super simple and everybody gets them. So say you don't want to eat a cookie, but you want to eat a cookie, right? It's like, I'm trying to not eat sweets, but, I got one right here and it looks really good. So the devotional approach would be to let both of those desires sit inside of you. Okay. And in order to do that, you have to relax. You have to relax, because if you tense up when you have conflicted desires, you will very quickly break. It's kind of like you're building a container for this combustion engine to happen inside of you. And this combustion, it's a polarity. It's between one desire that wants to go one way and one desire that wants to go another way. And what we want to do is we want to feed both of them attention. Feed them both truth and awareness, and they're both going to grow. Because that's what happens is when you look at a desire and you give it attention, you allow it to, your imagination to start running with it, then it's going to stoke emotion. So for example, if you give air to the idea of eating that cookie, well, then you're going to imagine that cookie and you're going to imagine how good it feels, and that's going to actually increase your desire for it, right? It's going to bring the desire up to here. Now, what happens if you think about the other side? If you think about, well, what are you trying to accomplish with your diet? Maybe you're trying to have, more stable energy levels so that you can be more productive. You want to get in better shape. You want to be able to perform better with your workouts. And you start building an image of like, well, what would it look like if I actually did that? Well, I'd be stronger. I'd be more productive. I would look better at the beach, like all these sorts of things. And that would bring your desire up as well. And so if you can stay in that long enough, you can stay in that conflict, you can hold it, and you can fan those flames, then one desire is going to end up bigger than the other. And my belief and my experience is that the true desire does win out. But only if you give it the time, only if you're able to actually be fully present with it. And you need to be able to actually avoid acting out on autopilot, because it's like, if you're not relaxed while this goes on, then it's kind of like the container breaks and then the energy spills out. And usually what that means is you just take the path of least resistance. So, if you're in that moment of making the decision and trying to hold these conflicted desires, then you just get tensed up and frustrated or whatever, then you're just going to lash out and you're probably going to just do the thing that's impulsive and doesn't quite serve you. Okay. If you do this with devotion, I think what you're potentially stepping into here is something unlimited. It's an abundant source, because if you watch any of my previous videos in this series, it's about tapping into that authentic expression. And there's an unlimited amount of you inside of you. There's an unlimited amount of expressive potential inside of you. And if you learn how to simply just turn all your desires up, well, then the good stuff's going to bubble to the top, and it's just always going to be there. It's like a cup constantly overflowing. Discipline, however, is different. It's like you've got a finite amount of resources that you can use to kind of repress and prune your life. And you can get better at it, and you can get very focused and concentrated on it, but it's going to limit you. And again, the ways in which it limits you, I think, are very, very important, because discipline is something you can do inauthentically. So you can discipline yourself to work toward a career that you actually don't want. And people do this all the time. It's like, oh, my mom says I got to be a doctor or a lawyer. And then they work really hard. They use a lot of discipline. They become that thing. They hate their life. You can't do that through devotion. You just can't, because authentically, there's no desire to really turn up there, right? You'd have to rely on something else, which in this case would be something like fear of rejection by your parents or whatever the thing is. Because it's not about getting anywhere. It's not about getting anything. It's about being someone, and that someone is you, the truest you. The truest you is the you at maximum desire. The things that you want the most are the things that are most authentic. They are the most you. And so all you have to do is tap into them. And to do that, you got to relax. You got to let the conflicts bounce around. It's uncomfortable. There is still sacrifice involved 100%. Just as much sacrifice as involved in discipline. And in some cases, it'll seem like more, but arguably, I think it ends up becoming like just so much easier. Like there's this one line, I might have mentioned it before, but there's this one line in the Bible that I keep coming back to where Jesus says, like, my burden is easy, my yoke is light, or something like that. And I think that's true, because it's like when you're really present with yourself, yes, there's a pain involved with being fully honest with what you want, with distilling your desires down, with letting the desires clash against each other. But if you let it happen, the good guy wins. That's the moral of the universe. And that's and inside of you, it's a microcosm of the whole universe. The truth will win if you give it space to work.
All right, there's so much in there. So let's just sum up. Discipline is focused on the outcome. So it has a getting or possessing mentality or achieving mentality. And when it faces obstacles, it's like a battering ram. So it requires a lot of energy and force of will. And that's a finite source. You can burn out and snap back into old habits or routines. And it can come from an inauthentic place. Because you can be disciplined in doing something or trying to produce something that you don't really desire. That happens if your motivation is out of guilt, fear, or I would add shame. I think of a client I used to see who disciplined himself to get a career as an engineer when really what he desired was to become a psychologist. But he was so scared of his father's disapproval that he only pursued a career in something he was certain his dad would approve of. And he never even expressed his desire to pursue psychology. He just went with what his brother had done, and he knew his dad approved of that, so he went into the same field, engineering. And yet he was not happy. So he was disciplined, but it was inauthentic. He was not really expressing his true desire. Devotion, however, is focused not on getting, but on giving and creating, on expressing values. When a devotion mindset hits obstacles, it's like a river. It flows around, or it swells, as Mark was saying. But it can also erode the obstacle. And that erosion can happen over time, or it can happen quickly, like a flood. And when the object of your devotion is really worthy of your attention, there's an abundant source. Why? Because it draws from your true desires. Devotion is never inauthentic. Instead of guilt, fear, or shame, the motivation is aspirational and yet also selfless. It comes from a secure place of peace, attachment, and honor. Now, what does this have to do with my sermon on worship? Well, my key verse was Romans 12, 1 and 2, which gives us a bit of a definition of worship. It explains that our act of worship is to be a living sacrifice, carrying our crosses each day. And this leads to transformation into the likeness of Christ. Hence, my one visual aid throughout that whole sermon, a mural I did of a person who had been carrying his cross so long that he began to resemble Christ himself. Why is this? Because as I elaborated in my last video, which was also elaborating on my sermon, that which you behold, you become. What you admire, you aspire to. And God designed and created us in his image. Therefore, nothing less than himself will satisfy the longings of our hearts. As I said in the sermon, and that which you value most is what you pursue. When you acknowledge all that God is and you call out to him, you pursue him in order to join with him. He is our good Father. And so when you truly get a revelation of who God is, you fall in love with him. You revere him. You admire him. And thus you seek to connect with him. You desire him. And you pursue him. And when you keep in mind the definition of devotion, Mark's video makes even more sense. Devotion comes from selfless affection and dedication to something, or rather, someone higher than yourself. See, discipline is entirely behavioral. And yes, devotion may involve discipline, but essentially it's all about desire, pursuing that which you truly value. And this is where I'm going to tie in theology of the body. But I'm going to leave it to Christopher West to say it.
The desire for God is written in the human heart, because man is created by God and for God, and God never ceases to draw man to himself. Only in God will he find the truth and happiness he never stops searching for. There is an ache deep in the heart of every human being. The church calls it the capax Dei, the capacity for God. It's also called, believe it or not, borrowing her language from the Greeks, the church calls this hunger, this yearning that only God can fill. The church calls it eros, E-R-O-S, from which we get the English word erotic. But don't confuse the Greek word eros with the other Greek word porneia. Porneia is the inversion of eros, a self-seeking eros. But the word eros means, and here I quote St. John Paul II's Theology of the Body, eros is the upward impulse of the human spirit towards the true, the good, and the beautiful. Capital T, truth, capital G, goodness, capital B, beauty, is what we're ultimately looking for. Eros, therefore, the church tells us, is our yearning for God. Capital T, truth, capital G, goodness, capital B, beauty. That word desire, if you look at the origin of the word, it's actually pretty interesting. It comes from the Latin desidere, which means to look to the stars or to await what the stars may bring. And here we gain a really profound insight into what happens when we aim our desire for God at anything less than God. What happens? Quite literally, disaster. Because disaster, aster is another word for stars in Latin, disaster means we've aimed our desire away from the stars. My brothers and sisters, we all have this ache. What are we looking for? What is this hunger? What is this yearning? Listen again to how the Catechism says it. The desire for God is written in the human heart. Only in God will we find the truth and happiness we never stop searching for. You know, oftentimes Christianity gets this bad reputation, like it's opposed to human desire. No. Christianity is not about suffocating the longings of the human heart, and here I'm quoting Pope Benedict XVI. Rather, Christianity is about freeing the longings of the heart so they can reach their true height. What is the true height to which our longings are meant to launch us? Nothing short of participating in the eternal ecstasy and joy of God Himself. Christianity is not opposed to desire. It's opposed to false fulfillments of desire. It's opposed to counterfeit satisfactions. Christianity is the invitation to the utmost infinite satisfaction of the heart's deepest longings, which can only be found in communion, in eternal ecstatic union with God.
You see, Christianity is the religion of desire. A desire for a relationship with our Creator that will fulfill all other desires of the heart. Sadly, because of legalism and some distorted ideas about what holiness is, we tend to think that Christianity is about squelching desire, but it's actually about the fulfillment of what we truly long for. That's why devotion is better than just discipline. And devotion is necessarily selfless. Otherwise, we would be inverting that desire for the infinite toward that which is finite. And then we end up in disaster. And the best object of devotion is a person. The person of Jesus Christ. The image of the living God. So we must get in touch with our true desires. That's the solution to when you feel torn over conflicting desires. Like Mark was saying, the disciplined mindset just solves that internal conflict by squashing any dissent. It leads to cutting off parts of yourself. But the devotion mindset isn't afraid of the conflict. In fact, it turns up the desires, allowing the conflict, and then integrates the parts of the self. And when you're devoted to a higher value, you can integrate all the parts of yourself. That's where true peace and wholeness come from. That's why whenever I do counseling with someone dealing with an unwanted sexual behavior or desire, I tell them it's not good enough to just stop the behavior. If you got a porn addiction, you just want coming in, I want to stop the porn. Like, yeah, we can work on that, but guess what? It's probably not going to work if all you're focused on is stopping the porn. You have to identify what you're aiming for. Who do you want to be? Who do you want to emulate? What kind of character do you desire to have? And pursue that. Be devoted to that call in your life to be the man of God God has created you to be. And yes, there will be sacrifice, but as you stay in touch with your deepest longing, the good guy, your spirit man who delights in the law of God, like it talks about in Romans 7, will win out. By the power of God, you will see that the good things you want to do, you will do. And this all ties back into my series of videos I was doing about transformational ex-gay ministry. There are some voices that say you should just focus on repentance and sacrifice of the same-sex desires. But that's a disciplined mindset. And yes, there are even some in the ex-gay ministry world that are stuck there themselves. There seems to be like a fear to aspire and pursue more. To take an honest look at one's longings and drill down to discover the true desires at the core that God has designed us for and destined us to fulfill in Him, ultimately in the next life and in His own ways in this life. So we should not fear our desires. They serve as windows into our hearts. And yes, those hearts may be wounded and deprived. this is what takes some people aback when we do reintegrative therapy. They're like, well, you actually want us to look at these desires and actually look at the fantasies? Because we don't squelch desire, nor do we indulge every desire, but we peer into them deeply. One of the other parts of Mark's video that relates to reintegrative therapy is his emphasis on being authentic. One of the earliest concepts Joseph Nicolosi teaches his clients is self-states. Now, a self-state is a frame of mind, a mode of thinking, feeling, and acting. I have found this model Nicolosi teaches to be helpful in explaining not just same-sex eroticization, but also pornography and sexual addiction, or just addiction in general. So let's go over the different self-states. All right, you're going to imagine you got sort of a continuum from left to right, and you have assertion as a first self-state. Now, the self-state of assertion is all about the authentic expression of self. About authentically expressing your thoughts, your feelings, your desires, and being an active agent in meeting your desires. You're not just letting life happen to you, but you're actively pursuing what you long for. And you're able to feel your feelings and deal with your feelings. You're feeling and dealing. And you're connected with others. So you have integrity. There's a cohesion between your thoughts, feelings, and desires, and you're connected with others, okay? So that's the self-state of assertion, all right? At the most basic, it's about the authentic expression of self. But then what happens is there's the potential for shame. And shame is all about disconnection. Disconnection within yourself, where, well, I have these thoughts, I have these feelings, but I can't express them. I can't pursue them. It's usually preceded by what we call a double bind, where it's usually a social situation, where there's a double bind, there's a lose-lose situation I'm in, where I'm feeling bad, I'm feeling negative, but if I were to express it, if I were to talk about it or try to talk about it or try to do something about it, I'll just make things worse. So I'm like, there's one bind here, I feel bad, but the other bind is I just can't open up about it. I can't be genuine and authentic about it. And so this supports this idea, the core belief of shame is that there's something about me that makes me unacceptable to others or to a particular person. So usually there's another person involved in this shame self-state. And so it's not really a full self-state. I'm often not truly connected with my thoughts. I'm not really feeling and dealing. And inevitably, if you stay in shame, you'll then progress, or really regress, into the gray zone. And this is even less of an authentic or true self-state. It's more of a mood state, and it's characterized by particular emotions, what we call the inhibitory emotions. Whereas in the self-state of assertion, you do feel emotions. You feel the more expressive emotions, because it's all about expression. So you're going to be expressing things like anger, sadness, as well as joy and excitement and enthusiasm and grief and pain. So they might seem like they have nothing in common, but all those emotions are ones that are expressed. But in the gray zone, it's characterized by the inhibitory emotions like shame, fear, anxiety, as well as boredom, apathy, numbness. These are all the emotions that hold you down. They hold you back from pursuing things that are meaningful to you. And also they prevent you from feeling the other emotions like happiness, like anger, like pain and sadness, because maybe they hurt too much to express them, or you don't trust enough to express them. And so the gray zone is just where you feel kind of blah, and you're just like down here, okay? And people that we work with in this field, they will say that with gray zone, that's That's my zip code. I live there all the time. And you can't really stay there forever. You want to feel something at some point, and so that leads to acting out. Whether it's a homosexual enactment or some pornography, or same-sex attraction, or opposite sex. It doesn't matter. It's some sort of acting out behavior. And you're now hyper-focused on feeling something. And so there's some degree, it's like a false assertion. It feels like you're being assertive, but you're not really getting in touch with your deeper desires. It's just you're doing something to feel good in that moment. And so it lifts you up, but it's going to bring it crashing right back down. Okay, so we see here how what Mark is talking about with being authentic, how it relates to this self-state model that is really at the core, or one of the main concepts that we train our clients in reintegrative therapy, or some of you may know it as reparative therapy, which is the old name. What we find is that when people are in their assertion self-state, when they're living authentically, when they're really pursuing what is meaningful to them, and they're connected with others, they're really expressing themselves openly and honestly with other people, and it's being reflected back to them. So there's a connection, what we call a double loop. I'm honestly expressing my true self, and someone is showing that they receive it, and they accept me, and they can reflect it back accurately. That's a double loop experience. That can undo that double bind that precedes the shame moment. So when people are in their assertion, and they're really feeling like they're their authentic self, their ideal self, or close enough to it, temptation doesn't have anything to latch on to. And so to tie it all together, when you get in touch with your deepest longings and you express them, when you're in that devotion mindset, you are the real you. And the real you is an imitator of Christ. So I tried to keep this brief, but I really wanted to tie a lot of different things together. I had a lot of thoughts from the sermon I did, but that was also inspired by that video from Mark Queppet, and from so many things that I've been learning from Theology of the Body and from Reintegrative Therapy. And so I hope this was also practical for you. So if you have some thoughts, if this got some gears turning for you, please express them in the comment section. Engage with the content. Don't forget to hit the like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. Until next time, God bless.